Hello and welcome to the Cultured Bumpkin, all you cultured bumpkins. This is chapter 46 of Southern Sense and Sensibility. Coming up on the end, and then we'll post it back up in complete audiobook format. If you're new here, welcome. If this is not your first time, thank you for joining. It's always good to see you. Let's dive right in, shall we? Chapter 46. Mary Ann's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow, and with youth, natural strength, and her mother's presence and aid, it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove within 4 days after the arrival of the latter into Mrs. Palmer's dressing room. When there, at her own particular request, for she was impatient to pour forth her thanks to him for fetching her mother, Colonel Brandon was invited to visit her. His emotion on entering the room, in seeing her altered looks, and in receiving the pale hand which she immediately held out to him, was such as, in Eleanor's conjecture, must arise from something more than his affection for Mary Ann, or the consciousness of its being known to others. And she soon discovered in his melancholy eye and varying complexion as he looked at her sister the probable recurrence of many past scenes of misery to his mind, brought back by that resemblance between Mary Ann and Eliza already acknowledged, and now strengthened by the hollow eye, the sickly skin, the posture of reclining weakness, and the warm acknowledgment of peculiar obligation. Mrs. Dashwood, not less watchful of what passed than her daughter, but with a mind very differently influenced, and therefore watching to a very different effect, saw nothing in the Colonel's behavior but what arose from the most simple and self-evident sensations, while in the actions and words of Mary Ann she persuaded herself to think that something more than gratitude already dawned. At the end of another day or two, Mary Ann, growing visibly stronger every 12 hours, Mrs. Dashwood, urged equally by her own and her daughter's wishes, began to talk of removing to Barton. On her measures depended those of her two friends. Mrs. Jennings could not quit Cleveland during the Dashwood stay, and Colonel Brandon was soon brought, by their united request, to consider his own abode there as equally determinate, if not equally indispensable. At his and Mrs. Jennings' united request in return, Mrs. Dashwood was prevailed on to accept the use of his carriage on her journey back for the better accommodation of her sick child, and the Colonel, at the joint invitation of Mrs. Dashwood and Mrs. Jennings, whose active good nature made her friendly and hospitable for other people as well as herself, engaged with pleasure to redeem it by a visit at the cottage in the course of a few weeks. The day of separation and departure arrived, and Mary Ann, after taking so particular and lengthened a leave of Mrs. Jennings, one so earnestly grateful, so full of respect and kind wishes, as seemed due to her own heart from a secret acknowledgment of past inattention, and bidding Colonel Brandon farewell with the cordiality of a friend, was carefully assisted by him into the carriage, of which he seemed anxious that she should engross at least half. Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor then followed, and the others were left by themselves to talk of the travelers and feel of their own dullness, till Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise to till Mrs. Jennings was summoned to her chaise to take comfort in the gossip of her maid for the loss of her two young companions, and Colonel Brandon immediately afterwards took his solitary way to Delaford. The Dashwoods were 2 days on the road, and Mary Ann bore her journey on both without essential fatigue. Everything that the most zealous affection, the most solicitous care could do to render her comfortable was the office of each watchful companion, and each found their reward in her bodily ease and her calmness of spirits. To Eleanor, the observation of the latter was particularly grateful. She who had seen her week after week so constantly suffering, oppressed by anguish of heart, which she had neither courage to speak of nor fortitude to conceal, now saw a joy which no other could equally share, an apparent composure of mind, which, in being the result, as she trusted, of serious reflection, must eventually lead her to contentment and cheerfulness. As they approached Barton, indeed, and entered on scenes of which every field and every tree brought some peculiar, some painful recollection, She grew, she grew silent and thoughtful, and turning away her face from her notice, and turning away her face from their notice, sat earnestly gazing through the window. But here Eleanor could neither wonder nor blame, and when she saw, as she assisted Marianne from the carriage, that she had been crying, she saw only an emotion too natural in itself to raise anything less tender than pity, and in its unobtrusiveness entitled to praise. In the whole of her subsequent manner, she traced the direction of a mind awakened to reasonable exertion. For no sooner had they entered their common sitting room than Marianne turned her eye around. Then Marianne turned her eyes around it with a then Marianne turned her eyes around it with a look of resolute firmness, as if determined at once to accustom herself to the sight of every object with which the remembrance of Willoughby could be connected. She said little, but every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, and though a sigh sometimes escaped her, it never passed away without the atonement of a smile. After dinner she would try her pianoforte. She went to it, but the music on which her eyes first rested was an opera procured for her by Willoughby, containing some of their favorite duets, and bearing on its outward leaf her own name in his handwriting. That would not do. She shook her head, put the music aside, and after running over the keys for a minute, complained of feebleness in her fingers and closed the instrument again, declaring, however, with a firmness as she did so, that she should in future practice much. The next morning produced no abatement in these happy symptoms. On the contrary, with a mind and body alike strengthened by rest, she looked and spoke with a more genuine spirit, anticipating the pleasure of Margaret's return, and talking of the dear family party which would then be restored, of their mutual pursuits and cheerful society as the only happiness worth a wish. "When the weather's settled and I've recovered my strength," said she, "we'll take long walks together every day. I'll walk to the farm at the edge of the down and see how the children go on. We'll walk to Sir John's new plantations at Barton Cross and the Abbey land, and we'll often go to the old ruins of the Priory and try to trace its foundation as far as we're told once they reach. And try to trace its foundation as far as we told they were once reached. I know we shall be happy. I know the summer will pass happily away. I mean never to be later in rising than 6, and from that time till dinner I shall divide every moment between music and reading. I've formed my plan, and I'm determined to enter on a course of serious study. Our own library is too well known to me to be resorted to for anything beyond mere amusement. But there are many works well worth reading at the park, and there are others of more modern productions which I know I can borrow of Colonel Brandon. By reading only 6 hours a day, I shall gain in the course of a 12-month a great deal of instruction which I now feel myself to want." Eleanor honored her for a plan which originated so nobly as this, though smiling to see the same eager fancy which had been leading her to the next extreme of languid indolence and self-repining, insolence and selfish repining, now at work in introducing excess into a scheme of such rational employment and virtuous self-control. Her smile, however, changed to a sigh when she remembered that promise to Willoughby was yet unfulfilled, and feared she had that to communicate which might again unsettle the mind of Marianne, and ruin, at least for a time, this fair prospect of busy tranquillity. Willing, therefore, to delay the evil hour, she resolved to wait till her sister's health were more secure before she appointed it. But the resolution was made only to be broken. Marianne had 2 or 3 days at home before the weather was fine enough for an invalid like herself to venture out. But at last a soft, genial morning appeared, such as might tempt the daughter's wishes and the mother's confidence, and Marianne, leaning on Eleanor's arm, was authorized to walk as long as she could without fatigue in the lane before the house. The sisters set out at a pace, slow as the feebleness of Marianne in an exercise hitherto untried since her illness required, and they had advanced only so far beyond the house as to admit a full view of the hill, the important hill behind, when pausing with her eyes turned towards it, Marianne calmly said, "There, Exactly there, pointing with one hand, pointing with one hand, on that projecting mound, there I fell, and there I first saw Willoughby. Her voice sunk with the word, but presently reviving, she added, "And I'm thankful to find that I can look with so little pain on the spot. Shall we ever talk on that subject, Eleanor?" Hesitatingly it was said, "Or will it be wrong? I can talk of it now, I hope, as I ought to." Eleanor tenderly invited her to be open. "As for the regret," said Marianne, "I have done with that as far as he's concerned. I don't mean to talk to you of what my feelings have been for him, but what they are now, at present. If I could be satisfied on one point, if I could be allowed to think that he was not always acting a part, not always deceiving me, but, above all, if I could be assured that he was never so wicked as my fears have sometimes fancied him, since the story of that unfortunate girl—" She stopped. Eleanor joyfully treasured her words as she answered, "If you could be assured of that, you think you should be easy." "Yes, my peace of mind is doubly involved in it. Not only is it horrible to suspect a person who has been what he has been to me of such designs, but what must it make me appear to myself? What in a situation like mine but a most shamefully unguarded affection could expose me to—" "How then," asked her sister, "would you account for his behavior?" "I suppose him, oh, how gladly I would suppose him only fickle, very, very fickle." Eleanor said no more. She was debating within herself on the eligibility of beginning her story directly or postponing it till Marianne were in stronger health, and they crept on for a few minutes in silence. "I'm not wishing him too much good," said Marianne at last with a sigh. "When I wish his secret reflections may be no more unpleasant than my own, he'll suffer enough in 'em." "Do you compare your conduct with his?" "No, I compare it with what it ought to have been. I compare it with yours. Our situations have borne little resemblance." "They have borne more than our conduct. Do not, my dearest Eleanor, let your kindness defend what I know your judgment must censure. My illness has made me think. It's given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. Long before I was enough recovered to talk, I was perfectly able to reflect. I considered the past. I saw in my own behavior, since the beginning of our acquaintance with him last autumn, nothing but a series of imprudence toward myself and want of kindness to others. I saw that my own feelings had prepared my sufferings, and that my want of fortitude under 'em had almost led me to the grave. My illness, I well knew, had been entirely brought on by myself, by such negligence of my own health as I had felt even at the time to be wrong. Had I died, it would have been self-destruction. I did not know my danger till the danger was removed, but with such feelings as these reflections gave me, I wonder at my recovery. Excuse me. But with what but with such reflections as these reflections gave but with such feelings as these reflections gave me, I wonder at my recovery. Wonder that the very eagerness of my desire to live, to have time for atonement to my God, and and to you all, did not kill me at once. Had I died, in what peculiar misery should I have left you, my nurse, my friend, my sister, you who have seen all the fretful selfishness of my latter days, who had known all the murmurings of my heart? How should I have lived in your remembrance? My mother, too. How could you have consoled her? I can't express my own abhorrence of myself. Whenever I looked towards the past, I saw some duty neglected or some failing indulged. Everybody seemed injured by me. The unceasing kindness of Mrs. Jennings I'd repaid with ungrateful contempt. To the Middletons, to the Palmers, the Steeles, to every common acquaintance even, I'd been insolent and unjust, with a heart hardened against their merits, and a temper irritated by their very attention. To John, to Fanny, yes, even to them, little as they deserve, I had given them less than their due. But you above all, above my mother, had been wronged by me. I, and only I, knew your heart and its sorrows. Yet to what did it influence me? Not to any compassion that could benefit you or myself. Your example was before me, but to what avail? Was I more considerate of you and your comfort? Did I imitate your forbearance or lessen your constraints by taking any part of those offices of general complacence or particular gratitude which you had hitherto been left to discharge alone? No, not less when I knew you to be unhappy than when I believed you at ease did I turn away from every exertion of duty or friendship, scarcely allowing sorrow to exist but with me, regretting only that regretting only that heart which had deserted and wronged me, and leaving you for, or I confessed an unbounded and leaving you, or I professed an unbounded affection to be miserable for my sake. Here ceased the rapid flow of her self-reproving spirit, and Eleanor, impatient to soothe, though too honest to flatter, gave her instantly that praise and support which her frankness and her contrition so well deserved. Marianne pressed her hand and replied, almost done. Almost done. Let's see. You are very good. The future must be my proof. I have laid down my plan, and if I'm capable of adhering to it, my feelings shall be governed, and my temper improved. They shall no longer worry others nor torture myself. I shall now live solely for my family. You, my mother, and Margaret must henceforth be all the world to me. You will share my affections entirely between you. From my home, I shall never again have the smallest incitement to move. And if I do mix in other society, it'll only be to show that my spirit is humbled, my heart amended, and that I can practice the civilities, the lesser duties of life with gentleness and forbearance. As for Willoughby, to say that I shall soon or that I shall ever forget him would be idle. His remembrance can be overcome by no change of circumstance or opinions, but it shall be regulated, it shall be checked by religion, by reason, by constant employment. She paused and added in a low voice, if I could but know his heart, everything would become easy. Eleanor, who had now been for some time reflecting on the propriety or impropriety of speedily hazarding her narration without feeling at all nearer decision than at first, heard this, and perceiving that as reflection did nothing, resolution must do all, soon found herself leading to the fact. She managed the recital as she hoped with address, prepared her anxious listener with caution, related simply and honestly the chief points on which Willoughby grounded his apology, did justice to his repentance, and softened only his protestations of present regard. Marianne said not a word. She trembled. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, and her lips became whiter than even sickness had left them. 1,000 inquiries sprung up from her heart, but she dared not urge one. She caught every syllable with panting eagerness. Her hand, unknowingly to herself, closely pressed her sister's, and tears covered her cheeks. Eleanor, dreading her being tired, led her towards home, until they reached the door of the cottage, easily conjecturing what her curiosity must be, though no question was suffered to speak it, talked of nothing but Willoughby and their conversations together, and was carefully minute in every particular of speech and look, where minuteness would be safely indulged. As soon as they entered the house, Marianne, with a kiss of gratitude and these two words just articulate through her tears, just articulate through her tears, tell Mamma, withdrew from her sister and walked slowly upstairs. Eleanor would not attempt to disturb a solitude so reasonable as what she now sought, and with a mind anxiously prearranging its result, and a resolution of reviving the subject again, should Marianne fail to do it, she turned into the parlor to fulfill her parting injunction. So that was the end of chapter 46. Let's see. I think I can do one more. I think I'll do one more. Excuse me. Chapter 47. Excuse me. Chapter 47. Mrs. Dashwood did not hear unmoved the vindication of her former favorite. She rejoiced in his being cleared from some part of his imputed guilt. She was sorry for him. She wished him happy. But the feelings of the past could not be recalled. Nothing could restore him with a faith unbroken, a character unblemished to Marianne. Nothing could do away the knowledge of what the latter had suffered through his means, nor remove the guilt of his conduct towards Eliza. Nothing could replace him, therefore, in her former esteem, nor injure the interests of Colonel Brandon. Had Mrs. Dashwood, like her daughter, heard Willoughby's story from himself, had she witnessed his distress and been under the influence of his countenance and his manner, it's probable that her compassion would have been greater. But it was neither in Elinor's power nor in her wish to rouse such feelings in another by her retailed explanation as had at first been called forth in herself. Reflection had given calmness to her judgment, and sobered her own opinion of Willoughby's deserts. She wished, therefore, to declare only the simple truth, and lay open such facts as were really due to his character, without any embellishment of tenderness to lead the fancy astray. In the evening, when they were all three together, Marianne began voluntarily to speak of him again, but that it was not without an effort. The restless, unquiet thoughtfulness in which she had been for some time previously sitting, her color rising as she spoke, and her unsteady voice plainly showed. "I will assure you both," said she, "that I see everything, as you can desire me to do." Mrs. Dashwood would have interrupted her instantly with soothing tenderness, had not Elinor, who really wished to hear her sister's unbiased opinion, by an eager sign, engaged her silence. Marianne slowly continued. "It's a great relief to me what Elinor told me this morning. I have now heard exactly what I wished to hear." For some moments her voice was lost, but recovering herself, she added, and with greater calmness than before, "I am now perfectly satisfied. I wish for no change. I never could have been happy with him after knowing, as sooner or later I must have known all this. I should have had no confidence, no esteem. Nothing could have done it away. Nothing could have done it away to my feelings." I know it, cried her mother. Happy with a man of libertine practices, with one who so injured the peace of the dearest of our friends and the best of men. No, my Marianne has not a heart to be made happy with such a man. Her conscience, her sensitive conscience, would have felt all that the conscience of her husband ought to have felt. Marianne sighed and repeated, "I wish for no change." "You consider the matter," said Elinor, "exactly as a good mind and a sound understanding must consider it. And I dare say you perceive, as well as myself, not only in this, but in many other circumstances, reason enough to be convinced that your marriage must have involved you in many certain troubles and disappointments, in which you would have been poorly supported by an affection on his side much less certain. Had you married, you must have always been poor. His expensiveness is acknowledged even by himself, and his whole conduct declares that self-denial is a word hardly understood by him. His demands and your inexperience together on very small income must have brought on distresses which would not be the less grievous to you, from having been entirely unknown and unthought of before. Your sense of honor and honesty would have led you, I know, when aware of your situation, to attempt all the economy that would appear to you possible. And perhaps as long as your frugality retrenched only on your own comfort, you might have been suffered to practice it. But beyond that, and how little could the utmost of your single management do to stop the ruin which had begun before your marriage? Beyond that, had you endeavored, however reasonably, to abridge his enjoyments, it's not to be feared that instead of prevailing on feelings so that instead of prevailing on feelings so selfish to consent it, you would have lessened your own influence on his heart and made him regret the connection which had involved him in such difficulties. Marianne's lips quivered and she repeated the word selfish in a tone that implied, "Do you really think him selfish?" "The whole of his behavior," replied Eleanor, from the beginning to the end of the affair has been grounded on selfishness. It was selfishness which first made him sport with your affections, which afterwards, when his own were engaged, made him delay the confession of it, and which finally carried him from Barton. His own enjoyment or his own ease was in every particular his ruling principle. It is very true. My happiness was never his object. At present, continued Eleanor, he regrets what he has done. And why does he regret it? Because he finds it has not answered towards himself. It has not made him happy. His circumstances are now unembarrassed. He suffers from no evil of that kind, and he thinks only that he has married a woman of less amiable temper than yourself. But does it follow that had he married you, he would have been happy? The inconveniences would have been different. He would have then suffered under the pecuniary distresses which, because they're removed, he now reckons as nothing. He would have had a wife of whose temper he could make no complaint, but he would have always been necessitous, always poor, and probably would soon have learned to rank the innumerable comforts of a clear estate and good income as of far more importance, even to domestic happiness, than the mere temper of a wife. "I have not a doubt of it," said Marianne, "and I have nothing to regret, nothing but my own folly." Rather say your mother's impudent Rather say your mother's imprudence, my sorry. Rather say your mother's imprudence, my child, said Mrs. Dashwood. She must be answerable. Marianne would not let her proceed, and Eleanor, satisfied that each felt their own error, wished to avoid any survey of the past that might weaken her sister's spirits. She therefore, pursuing the first subject, immediately continued. One observation, I think, may fairly be drawn from the whole story, that all Willoughby's difficulties have arisen from the first offense against virtue in his behavior to Eliza Williams. That crime has been the origin of every lesser one and of all his present discontents. Marianne assented most feelingly to the remark, and her mother was led by it to an enumeration of Colonel Brandon's injuries and merits, warm as friendship and design could unitedly dictate. Her daughter did not look, however, as if it were much heard by her. Eleanor, according to her expectation, saw on the 2 or 3 following days that Marianne did not continue to gain strength as she had done. But while her resolution was unsubdued, and she still tried to appear cheerful and uneasy, her sister could safely trust to the effect of time upon her health. Margaret returned, and the family were again all restored to each other, again quietly settled at the cottage. And if not pursuing their usual studies with quite so much vigor as when they first came to Barton, at least planning a vigorous prosecution of them in future. Eleanor grew impatient for some tidings of Edward. She had heard nothing of him since her leave in London, nothing of his new plans, nothing certain even of his present abode. Some letters had passed between her and her brother in consequence of Marianne's illness, and in the first of John's there had been this sentence: "We know nothing of our unfortunate Edward, and can make no inquiries on so prohibited a subject, but conclude him to still be at Oxford," which was all the intelligence of Edward afforded her by the correspondence, for his name was not even mentioned in any of the succeeding letters. She was not doomed, however, to be long in ignorance of his measures. Getting on here. Their manservant had been sent one morning to Exeter on business, and when, as he waited at table, he had satisfied the inquiries of his mistress as to the event of his errand, there was this voluntary communication. "I suppose you know, ma'am, that Mr. Ferris is married?" Marianne gave a violent start, fixed her eyes upon Eleanor, saw her turning pale, and fell back in her chair in hysterics. Mrs. Dash, Mrs. Dashwood, whose eyes, as she answered the servant's inquiry, had intuitively taken the same direction, was shocked to perceive by Eleanor's countenance how much she really suffered, and a moment afterwards, alike distressed by Marianne's situation, knew not on which child to bestow her principal attention. The servant, who saw only that Miss Marianne was taken ill, had sense enough to call one of the maids, who, with Mrs. Dashwood's assistance, supported her into the other room. By that time, Marianne was rather better, and her mother, leaving her to the care of Margaret and the maid, returned to Eleanor, who, though still much disordered, had so far recovered the use of her reason and voice as to be just beginning an inquiry of Thomas as to the source of his intelligence. Mrs. Dashwood immediately took all that trouble on herself, and Eleanor had the benefit of the information without the exertion of seeking it. "Who told you that Mr. Ferris was married, Thomas?" "I see Mr. Ferris myself, ma'am, this morning, in Exeter, and his lady, too, Miss Steele, was it? Miss Steele, as was. They was stopping in the chaise at the door of the New London Inn, as I went there with a message from Sally at the park of her brother, who's one of the postboys. I happened to look up as I went by the chaise, and so I see directly it was the youngest Miss Steele. So I took off my hat, and she knew me and called to me, and inquired after you, ma'am, and the young ladies, especially Miss Marianne, and bid me I should give her compliments and Mr. Ferris's, their best compliments and service, and how sorry they was they had not time to come on and see you, but they was in a great hurry to go forwards, for they was going further down for a little while, but howsoever when they come back, they'd be sure to come and see you." "But did she tell you she was married, Thomas?" "Yes, ma'am. She smiled. She said she had changed her name since she was last in these parts. She was always very affable and a free-spoken young lady, very civil-headed, so I made free to wish her joy." "Was Mr. Ferris in the carriage with her?" "Yes, ma'am. I just seen him leaning back, but he did not look up. He was never a gentleman much for talking." Eleanor's heart could easily account for his not putting himself forward, and Mrs. Dashwood probably found the same explanation. "Was there no one else in the carriage?" "No, ma'am, only they two." "Do you know where they came from?" "They come straight from town, as Miss Lucy, Mrs. Ferris, told me." "And are they going farther westward?" "Yes, ma'am, but not to bide long. They'll soon be back again, and then they'd be sure and call here." Mrs. Dashwood now looked at her daughter, but Eleanor knew better than to expect them. She recognized the whole of Lucy in the message, and was very confident that Edward would never come near them. She observed in a low voice to her mother that they were probably going down to Mr. Pratt's near Plymouth. Thomas's intelligence seemed over. Eleanor looked as if she wished to hear more. "Did you see him off before you came away?" "No, ma'am. The horses were just coming out, but I could not bid any longer. I was afraid of being late." "Did Mrs. Ferris look well?" "Yes, ma'am. She said how she was very well, and to my mind she was always a very handsome young lady, and she seemed very vastly contented." Mrs. Dashwood could think of no other question, and Thomas and the tablecloth, now alike needless, were soon afterwards dismissed. Marianne had already sent to say that she should eat nothing more. Mrs. Dashwood's and Eleanor's appetites were equally lost, and Margaret might think herself very well off, that with such uneasiness as both her sisters had lately experienced, so much reason as they often had to be careless of their meals, she had never been obliged to go without her dinner before. When the dessert and the wine were arranged, and Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were left by themselves, they remained long together in a similarity of thoughtlessness and silence. Mrs. Dashwood feared to hazard any remark, and ventured not to offer consolation. She had now found that she had erred in relying on Eleanor's representation of herself, and justly concluded that everything had been expressly softened at the time to spare her from an increase of happiness, to spare her from an increase of unhappiness, suffering as she had suffered for Marianne. She found that she had been misled by the careful, the considerate attention of her daughter to think the attachment which once she had so well understood much slighter in reality than she had been wont to believe, or than it was now proved to be. She feared that under this persuasion she had been unjust, inattentive, nay, almost unkind to Eleanor. That Marianne's affliction, because more acknowledged more immediately before her, had too much engrossed her tenderness and led her away to forget that in Eleanor she might have a daughter suffering as much, certainly with less self-provocation and greater fortitude. That was chapter 47. So we will stop there tonight and pick back up with chapter 48 next time. So thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe if you haven't, and thank you very much for watching along, listening along. And we only got 3 more 48, 49, 50. Got 3 more chapters before we start something else. So I will be looking to the listeners, the viewers for the next book. So if you got some in mind, let me know. Thanks for watching. Talk to you later.